Hold a silver Spanish real from the 16th century in your hand. It feels heavy, cold, permanent. Once this piece of metal could buy a farm, a ship, or the loyalty of an army. Today the metal remains, but the empire that minted it is nothing but a footnote. We are taught to believe history is a straight line of progress. It isn't. It is a closed loop, a biological cycle that resets almost exactly every 250 years. Look at your screen today. Record debt, fractured politics, a currency losing its trust. These aren't technical errors. They aren't bugs in the system. They are the final symptoms of a clock that is about to strike 12. The mechanism is already started. The question isn't whether the reset is coming. The question is exactly what time is it. We are often told that empires fall because of a single catastrophic event, a barbarian invasion, a lost war, a sudden plague. That is a comforting lie. It comforts us because it suggests that if we just avoid that one bad event, we are safe. But the forensic evidence of history tells a different story. Civilizations do not die from murder. They die from suicide. Or more accurately, they die of old age. There is a biological clock ticking inside every superpower. Ray Dalio calls it the Big Cycle. It is a rhythm that is repeated for the Dutch, the British, and the Americans with terrifying precision. It doesn't matter what language they speak or what god they pray to. The math always plays out the same way. The cycle begins with the rise. Think of this as the youth of a nation. In this phase, the society is poor, but it is hungry. The debt is low. The work ethic is high. There is no financial engineering yet, only hard production. People earn money because they make things that the world actually needs. Education is valued not for status, but for survival. The generations in this phase know that if they don't work, they don't eat. So they build, they save, and they become powerful. Then comes the top. This is the phase that feels the best, but it is the most dangerous, because success is a sedative. When a nation becomes the richest in the world, the psychology changes. We stop working so hard. We start hiring others to do the hard work for us. We stop being the factory of the world and become the banker of the world. We start betting on our past reputation to finance our future consumption. This is the moment the rot sets in. Because we are rich, we become expensive. Because we are expensive, we lose competitiveness. But instead of cutting back, we borrow. We borrow to maintain a lifestyle we can no longer afford with cash. Asset prices soar, the stock market looks invincible. But it's a mirage. The wealth isn't coming from productivity anymore. It's coming from leverage, and that leads inevitably to the decline. This is the stage where the internal friction becomes too hot to ignore. The gap between the haves and the have-nots becomes a canyon. The rich, who own the assets, get richer as the debt piles up. The poor, who pay the rent, get crushed by the cost of living. The society splits. Left versus right. Capital versus labor. The city versus the country. You see it in the streets. Populism rises. The people demand a solution. They demand fairness. And the government, terrified of a revolution, chooses the only tool it has left. It doesn't cut spending. It doesn't tell the truth. It prints money. They try to inflate away the debt. They try to print prosperity. Economists on TV will call these moments temporary corrections or soft patches. History has a different name for it. It is stage 3 financial cancer. When a society begins to believe it has the right to consume without the obligation to produce, the countdown has already begun. The empire is still standing. The buildings are still tall. The army is still fearsome. But the heart has stopped beating. Most people look at the borders for signs of the end. They look for tanks or missiles, but the clearest signal isn't at the border. It is right there, in your pocket. We think of money as a fact. It is not. It is a belief system. And beliefs are far more fragile than gold. To understand why your salary buys less every year, you have to look at the history of the clip. In the ancient world, when an emperor wanted to spend money he didn't have, he committed a fraud called debasement. He would take the silver coins, clip the edges, or melt them down to mix in cheap copper. The Roman denarius started as nearly pure silver. By the end of the 3rd century, it was barely 2% silver. The coin looked the same, but the value had been hollowed out from the inside. Today our governments are more sophisticated. They don't use metal files. They use keyboards. But the mechanism is identical. This is the cycle of currency death, and it happens in 3 distinct stages. Stage 1 is hard money. This is honest money. Gold, silver. It has value because it is rare and hard to produce. Stage 2 is paper claims. Banks issue receipts for the gold. It's convenient. People start treating the receipt as the money. Trust builds. Credit expands. The economy feels breathless and exciting. Then comes the crisis. It always does. A war, a plague, or a banking panic. People run to the banks to demand the gold behind the paper. And the government, facing a collapse, makes a choice. They close the window. They break the link. This is stage 3, fiat money. Now the paper is backed by nothing but public confidence. This sounds noble, but in practice, it gives the state a license to print infinite units of currency. Look at the scoreboard. It is terrifying. Of the roughly 750 currencies that have existed in the last 400 years, 80% have disappeared. They didn't just lose value. They cease to exist. The survivors? They are all in the process of dying. The British pound, the oldest living currency, has lost over 99% of its value since it was unpegged from gold. Every time a government prints money, they will tell you it is necessary. They call it stimulus or liquidity or emergency relief. They promise that this time is different. They promise they are printing money to save the economy. But here is the dry irony they never say out loud. They are saving the economy by killing the currency. They are choosing to save the borrower by sacrificing the saver. If you are holding cash during this phase, hoping for safety, you are making a mathematical error. You are not saving. You are bleeding. You are being taxed silently, every single day, by a system designed to transfer wealth from those who hold the currency to those who print it. The robbery is invisible, so nobody protests, but the result is absolute. This isn't a modern theory. We have seen this play out before, in the halls of the greatest empire of the 16th century. They had the money, they had the power, and they still managed to go bankrupt. Let's look at the first giant to fall for the illusion of infinite wealth. In the 16th century, Spain didn't just win the lottery, they owned the casino. The Spanish galleons returned from the New World heavy with Potosi silver. It was the greatest transfer of wealth the world had ever seen. On paper, Spain should have been the dominant economic power for 1,000 years. But they made a fatal calculation error. They confused money with wealth. Because silver was flooding into the country, the currency lost its purchasing power. This was the price revolution. Prices in Spain skyrocketed higher than the rest of Europe. Suddenly, it became cheaper to import goods from abroad than to manufacture them at home. So the Spanish industries died. Why build a textile factory when you can just buy the cloth from the Dutch? The domestic economy hollowed out. The aristocracy, a tiny 2% of the population, owned 95% of the land. But instead of planting grain to feed their people, they turned the land over to sheep grazing to support the powerful Mesta Guild. They chose wool over bread. They chose raw resources over human productivity. The crown became addicted to spending. Charles V and Philip II launched massive, expensive military campaigns to project power across the globe. To fund these wars, they didn't just spend the silver they had in the vault. They borrowed from foreign bankers, pledging future silver shipments as collateral. They were mortgaging an empire that hadn't even been mined yet. The result is one of the darkest jokes in financial history. The nation that owned the world's money supply ran out of money. The Spanish crown declared bankruptcy not once, but 4 times in less than 40 years. In 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596. They defaulted while sitting on a mountain of silver. This is the lesson that modern politicians pretend not to see. Money is just a medium of exchange. Production is the only real wealth. If you stop making things, it doesn't matter how much currency you print or how much silver you steal. You are bankrupt. Spain collapsed because they thought wealth was something you found, not something you built. But the next giant to fall didn't suffer from laziness. They suffered from ambition. Before the First World War, London was the undisputed heartbeat of the global economy. The British Empire was the world's greatest creditor, and the pound sterling, backed by gold, was the universal language of trade. It was a world where the sun never set on British land, and more importantly, British credit. But power has a price, and that price is usually paid in blood and compound interest. The world wars didn't just break the British spirit, they broke the British ledger. By 1945, a nation that once owned the world had become its greatest beggar, surviving on American Lend-Lease programs. Debt hit 250% of GDP. They had liquidated their foreign assets, emptied their gold vaults, and effectively handed the keys of the global reserve currency to Washington at Bretton Woods. The moment of absolute realization didn't happen in a trench, it happened in a bank during the Suez Crisis of 1956. Britain, alongside France, tried to reclaim the Suez Canal by force. Militarily, they were winning, but the United States didn't use a single bullet to stop them. President Eisenhower simply threatened to sell off the U.S. holdings of the British pound and block IMF loans. He threatened to crash their currency until they surrendered. Britain withdrew in humiliation. Not because they were outgunned, but because they were outfinanced. It was proof that if you spend someone else's money to fuel your tanks, you are no longer the one driving them. By 1976, the former empire was forced to beg the IMF for a bailout, accepting austerity measures dictated by international bureaucrats. The reserve currency status was gone. The empire was gone. All that remained was the debt. The British didn't lose their empire because they lost their courage. They lost it because they could no longer afford the maintenance. But why did they keep spending even when the vaults were empty? Because of a terminal strategic disease known as military overstretch. Paul Kennedy famously called it military overstretch. In simpler terms, it is the act of paying for an insurance policy that costs more than the house itself. It is the most consistent trap in the history of great powers, and it is built on a fundamental strategic imbalance. To maintain a global empire, you must project power. But projection requires resources, and eventually the cost of securing the system begins to cannibalize the system itself. This is the downward spiral of the great powers. Every empire faces a brutal three-way choice for its spending. Military defense, known as guns, domestic consumption, known as butter, and investments for economic growth. In the beginning, a rising power balances these well, But as the empire matures and faces rivals, the guns portion begins to swell. This creates a mathematical trap called the upward spiral. Every new generation of fighter jets, warships, and missile systems is exponentially more expensive than the one before, even after adjusting for inflation. You are spending more and more capital just to maintain the same level of security. The irony is purely forensic. As military costs rise, they divert capital away from the very things that made the empire strong in the first place: innovation, education, and infrastructure. This leads to slower economic growth. To cover the gap, the government raises taxes, or, more commonly, borrows more money. The domestic population begins to fracture as they argue over shrinking resources. They see the butter disappearing while the guns get more expensive. When you reach this stage, the empire has become a hollow shell. You have a perfect high-tech defense system standing guard over a stagnant, divided, and debt-ridden society. It is a masterpiece of engineering, protecting a bankrupt vault. In the final stages, the interest payments on the debt used to buy those weapons start to exceed the cost of the weapons themselves. At that point, the collapse isn't a political choice, it is a mathematical certainty. Most empires refuse to see the math until it is too late. They believe their past glory exempts them from the laws of physics. But those laws are playing out right now, in the most powerful nation on the planet. We are no longer looking at historical ghosts, we are looking at the scoreboard of the present. The numbers flashing on our screens today are the exact same markers that once signaled the end for 16th century Spain and 20th century Britain. The federal debt has surged past $38 trillion, but the total number is less terrifying than the velocity. We are now paying nearly $1 trillion a year just in interest payments. To put that into perspective, the United States is now spending almost as much on its past debts as it is on its current defense. Since the gold standard was abandoned in 1971, the US dollar has lost approximately 86% of its purchasing power. While the world was busy watching stock market rallies, their labor was being devalued in real time, the dollar's share of global reserves has slipped to around 58%. This is the slow, silent erosion of the exorbitant privilege, the unique ability of the United States to print currency to buy the world's goods. This brings us to the Triffin paradox. To keep the global economy fueled with liquidity, the US must run permanent deficits, pushing dollars out into the world. But those same permanent deficits are exactly what erode global confidence in the dollar's value. It is a system that requires its own destruction to function. We have enjoyed a 50-year free lunch, financed by the rest of the world's willingness to hold our debt. But the waiter has finally arrived at the table with the bill. The symptoms of the late cycle are everywhere, and they are not just financial. We see crumbling infrastructure, a hollowed-out middle class, and internal political polarization that borders on the pathological. Like the British before the First World War, the US maintains a vast network of global military bases it can no longer comfortably afford. Policy has shifted from leadership to transaction, using financial coercion rather than trust to maintain alliances. It is the behavior of an empire that is still fearsome, but increasingly inward-looking and dominated by financial panic. When a superpower starts prioritizing debt maintenance over domestic innovation, the transition is already underway. Most citizens are still arguing over the political theater on the stage, unaware that the stage itself is beginning to tilt. While the old giant is distracted by its own internal friction and gasping for fiscal breath, a new challenger is playing a much older, much more patient game. Rising powers don't usually start with an invasion. They start with a calculator. While the Western world was distracted by the short-term theater of consumer debt and financial engineering, a new challenger was quietly following the oldest playbook in history. They didn't build a global navy first, they built a global factory. Since the beginning of its reform period in 1978, China has undergone a transformation that is mathematically staggering. Its GDP per capita has increased 25-fold, and its share of global GDP has surged from a mere 2% to 22%. This isn't just growth, it is a rapid migration through the rise phase of the big cycle. They are investing in the primary determinants of power that the old giants have begun to neglect. Education is their cornerstone. China now accounts for 31% of all STEM graduates worldwide. They aren't just training workers, they are cultivating the architects of the next era. They hold 41% of global patents, signaling a shift from a copycat economy to a leader in innovation and technology. While the established powers argue over how to divide a shrinking pie, the challenger is focused entirely on baking a bigger one. The strategy is a deliberate inversion of the late-stage mistakes we've analyzed. In the 1980s, the Four Modernizations program prioritized agriculture, industry, and science over the military. They understood what Spain and Britain forgot. You build the economic base first. Only after the foundation is unbreakable do you project power. This patient sequential approach is the exact opposite of the military overstretch that hollowed out the empires of the past. We often label this rise as a political threat or a modern anomaly. But from the perspective of a historian, it is simply the rule of succession playing out in real time. You cannot stop the sun from rising with a set of sanctions, and you cannot stop a rising power that is outproducing, outsaving, and out-educating you. It is a forensic reality that doesn't care about our ideologies. The world order doesn't change with a sudden explosion. It changes one trade deal at a time, one patent at a time, and eventually one currency at a time. The challenger is now gradually internationalizing its own currency, moving to bypass a dollar system that it views as increasingly weaponized and unstable. They are waiting for the moment when the world realizes that the old giant is no longer the safest house on the block. The transition is subtle until it is absolute, and it leaves us with one final, uncomfortable question. In a world where the old rules are breaking and the new ones are being written in a different language, where does that leave you? History is not destiny, but it is a map. 16th century Spain believed their silver was eternal. 20th century Britain believed the Royal Navy was invincible. And today we are led to believe the dollar is immortal. But numbers do not lie, and they do not have a political bias. When a nation consistently spends more than it earns, when it prints currency to paper over its social fractures, and when it attempts to maintain global dominance on a credit card, the conclusion has already been written in the archives of time. The patterns are invariant. You cannot change the cycle of empires any more than you can change the seasons. But you can choose your position within that cycle. You can choose to sleep within the illusion of paper wealth, or you can choose to be the one who feels the wind change before the storm arrives. Real power does not belong to those who print the money. It belongs to those who understand where the value actually lives when the printing presses finally stop. If you want to continue decoding the hidden laws of money that the textbooks refuse to teach, leave a 1 in the comments and subscribe to Financial Money History. The map is in your hands. What you do with it is up to you.